Language begins with identification. Before we understand the world, we are taught to refer to ourselves. I want. I don't like that. I'm scared. From early childhood, the word I becomes the most familiar coordinate in our mental map. We are trained to experience life from a first-person perspective, to treat our stream of consciousness as centered around a stable self. It feels like a given, so natural that it rarely seems worth examining. But what is this I, really? Is it a thing, a substance, a persistent observer? Or is it just a useful linguistic function, a shorthand for the shifting contents of mind? David Hume, writing in the 18th century, approached the self not as a metaphysical assumption, but as a phenomenon open to investigation. As an empiricist, he believed that knowledge should arise only from what can be directly observed or inferred from experience. So when he turned his gaze inward, asking, "What is the self?" he did not begin with what seemed intuitively true. He began with scrutiny, and what he found was absence. He famously wrote, "When I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception, of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception." In other words, when we attempt to observe the self, to find the supposed observer behind perception, all we find are perceptions themselves. There is no thinker behind the thought, no feeler behind the feeling. There is only the unfolding of experience, moment after moment. For Hume, the self is not an entity but a bundle of impressions, memories, emotions, and associations, loosely tied together by habit and language. It is not a unified object, but a flow, a stream, something more like a process than a person. There is no anchor in this view, no metaphysical core, just an ongoing, shifting tapestry of mental events. This perspective radically disrupts how we imagine personal identity. If the self is merely a collection of transient experiences, then there is no enduring subject who owns them. There is only experience, and the mistaken inference that someone must be having it. The metaphor of the self as a ship, solid, moving steadily through time, collapses under Hume's analysis. We are not ships, we are waves, temporary configurations in a sea of mental motion, and waves, by their nature, do not persist. They arise, crest, and vanish. No part of a wave stays the same from moment to moment, yet we give it a name and treat it as a thing. What Hume offered was not nihilism, but a challenge. If there is no fixed I, then our assumptions about responsibility, desire, and even suffering must be reconsidered. What does it mean to grieve or regret when there is no stable self to locate the loss? His insight wasn't meant to erase our humanity. It was meant to make us more honest about what we are. Centuries before Western philosophers wrestled with the illusion of identity, Buddhist thought had already dismantled the notion of a fixed, independent self. At the heart of its teaching lies the doctrine of anatta, the rejection of any permanent, unchanging soul or essence behind our mental and physical life. This insight is not merely spiritual, but rigorously analytical. It observes, dissects, and dissolves the assumptions we make about who or what we are. According to the Buddha, what we typically refer to as a person is simply the convergence of 5 aggregates, skandhas: form, the body; sensation, perception; mental formations, thoughts, emotions, impulses, and consciousness. None of these elements are stable, none are constant, and none, either individually or in combination, form a self. It is a profound reframing. The self is not behind experience. It is constructed from experience, and only temporarily. Like a whirlpool in a river, it appears to have shape, persistence, and identity. But upon inspection, it has no core. It is motion, mistaken for substance. The famous analogy of the chariot captures this insight perfectly. A chariot is not the wheel, or the axle, or the frame. It is not any one part, nor is it the mere collection of parts. The term chariot is simply a convenient designation for something that has no independent essence. So too with the self. This perspective doesn't seek to devalue the human being, but to free it. The burden of defending, improving, or rescuing the self, an effort most people spend their entire lives engaged in, rests on a misunderstanding. If there is no fixed self to begin with, there is nothing that needs to be defended so desperately. Psychological suffering, in the Buddhist view, is often rooted in clinging to status, to control, to permanence, to identity. Letting go of the illusion of a solid I does not mean becoming empty. It means becoming unburdened. If there is no one to be humiliated, we become free of shame. If there is no one to be exalted, we become free of pride. The ego's game falls apart. This teaching, far from abstract, is experiential. It invites inquiry, not belief. Sit. Observe. Where is the self? Is it the breath, the thoughts, the awareness of the thoughts? When looked at clearly, each of these proves unstable, impermanent, not self. In this way, Buddhist philosophy anticipates thinkers like Hume and Parfit, not just in denying the self, but in offering a way of life beyond it, a life not rooted in story, but in presence, not defined by identity, but liberated from it. In a world of crumbling assumptions and epistemic doubt, René Descartes sought something unshakable. His method, famously, was to question everything, to throw out all beliefs that could, even in the slightest way, be false. What remained, after this ruthless skepticism, was a single conviction: cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. It was meant to be the ultimate foundation, the one certainty immune to doubt. For Descartes, the very act of doubt confirmed the existence of a doubter, even if every perception could be manipulated by an evil demon. The experience of doubt proved that there was something, someone, doing the doubting. Thought, it seemed, required a thinker. From this single premise, he sought to rebuild philosophy, science, and theology. But herein lies the tension. Descartes was committed to the existence of the self, yet he never precisely defined what this I was. Was it the soul, the mind, a distinct substance divorced from the body? His dualism famously posited a split between res cogitans, the thinking thing, and res extensa, the extended thing, or the physical body. But this separation only raised more questions than it answered. For centuries, his foundational statement remained influential, not just in philosophy, but in how the modern world began to conceive of individuality. The autonomous, self-evident, rational I became a cultural ideal, the sovereign subject, responsible for its actions, its beliefs, and its fate. Yet many later thinkers saw in Descartes' certainty not a strength, but a sleight of hand. Was he truly discovering the self, or merely asserting it by grammatical necessity? I think, therefore I am, presupposes that thought belongs to a subject. But what if thought arises without one? This is precisely the challenge posed by Nietzsche and echoed in Eastern philosophy. There might be thinking, but does it follow that there is a thinker? Even in neuroscience, the Cartesian model has struggled. Brain activity does not suggest a central control hub or a fixed I pulling levers. What we call consciousness appears to be an emergent, distributed process, a series of patterns coalescing into coherence, not a singular entity directing the show. Descartes' desire for certainty, though noble, may have distorted the question itself. In seeking something indubitable, he inadvertently embedded the self into the foundation, mistaking structure for substance. It is as if, in the ruins of belief, he clung to the only thread he could find and called it truth. But what if certainty is the wrong aim altogether? What if the human mind is not a fortress, but a field, open, plural, in flux? Descartes offered reassurance in a time of chaos, but in doing so, he may have given us a self more fictional than the illusions he sought to destroy. Friedrich Nietzsche, unlike Descartes, was not in search of certainty. He was in search of honesty, a radical, often brutal confrontation with the human condition. And among the most persistent illusions, in his view, was the belief in a unified, coherent self. For Nietzsche, the self was not a substance, not a soul, not an inner essence. It was a fiction, a convenient myth constructed through language, shaped by social forces, and used as a tool of control. He did not deny the phenomena of thought, will, or memory, but he denied that there had to be a singular I behind them, holding the reins. A thought comes when it wishes, not when I wish, he wrote. It is a falsification to say, the subject I is the condition of the predicate think. In other words, the sentence, I think, already contains a distortion. Thought does not prove a thinker, it merely reveals that thinking is happening. The subject is an afterthought, a linguistic convention, not a metaphysical reality. Nietzsche saw identity not as the cause of our actions, but as a post hoc narrative we impose on them. The self, in his view, was more like a mask, worn by deeper, less visible forces. These forces act first. The ego arrives later, claiming authorship. We mistake the shadow for the source. This diagnosis has profound implications. If the self is not real, then neither is moral responsibility in the way it's commonly understood. There is no inner moral agent, no metaphysical judge inside us. What we call character or integrity is just the temporary stabilization of conflicting impulses. There is no true self, only habits, preferences, and inherited patterns. But Nietzsche's dismantling of the self is not nihilistic, it is liberating. If there is no fixed identity, then we are not bound to a single story. We are not required to be consistent with who we once were. There is no essential me that must be obeyed, defended, or avenged. There is only the possibility of becoming. This is where Nietzsche departs from simple skepticism and steps into something creative. Become who you are, he urges, a phrase that only makes sense once we recognize that the self is not a discovery, but an invention, not a thing to be unearthed, but a project to be sculpted. In this light, identity is not a truth, but a task. The fiction of self need not be erased, but it must be seen as fiction. Only then do we gain the freedom to rewrite it, to stop being loyal to a mask, to stop being trapped by the echo of an old name. In the 20th and 21st centuries, philosophy has increasingly shifted its attention from metaphysical debates about the existence of the self to investigations of how the self is constructed, sustained, and deployed. The question is no longer whether the self exists in some essential form, but how, and for what purpose, the concept of self functions in human life. Philosophers like Ludwig Wittgenstein, Michel Foucault, and Judith Butler approach the self not as a metaphysical entity, but as a linguistic, social, and political construct. The self, in these accounts, is not something we uncover, but something we learn, a role we are taught to perform within a particular language, culture, and historical moment. Wittgenstein emphasized that meaning arises not from inner essence, but from use, from how words function in specific forms of life. The word I is not a label for some metaphysical object. It is a tool, a grammatical device used within specific language games. To say, I am in pain, is not to report on a hidden substance called the self, but to participate in a shared human expression. The self, then, becomes less of a thing and more of a position, a standpoint constructed by the grammar of our speech. Foucault went further, suggesting that the self is a product of power. Our identities are shaped by discourses, systems of knowledge that define what it means to be sane or insane, moral or immoral, normal or deviant. The modern self, he argued, is an invention of institutions, schools, prisons, clinics, bureaucracies. These structures create subjects by classifying, regulating, and internalizing norms. Identity becomes a mechanism of control. Judith Butler extended this analysis into the domain of gender. For her, identity is performative. It is not something one is, but something one does, repeatedly and under social compulsion. The self is the sedimentation of acts, gestures, and expressions that, over time, create the illusion of substance. There is no inner core. There is only the echo of norms enacted through the body. In these perspectives, the self is not a given, but a product. It is not universal, but historical, not natural, but political. To question the self, then, is not an exercise in metaphysics, but an active critique, a way of exposing how certain identities are imposed, naturalized, and made invisible. These insights do not render the self meaningless. On the contrary, they show how much is at stake in its construction. Who gets to define the self? Who benefits from the dominant narrative of what a self should be? And what happens when individuals resist, subvert, or reimagine the story they've been told? In this way, contemporary philosophy does not abolish the self. It denaturalizes it. It reveals it as a convention, real in its effects, but mutable in its form. And that, perhaps, is where both the danger and the possibility lie. To speak of the disappearance of the self is not to speak of annihilation, but of a quiet shift, a falling away of the illusion that there is someone inside, owning thoughts and emotions. What dissolves is not life, but the story around it. This isn't some grand event. It happens in small, unremarkable moments, when thought passes without being claimed, when silence is no longer something to fill. Through these cracks, something real shines through, not a deeper self, but the absence of needing one. The disappearance of the self is not loss, but liberation. Without a self to protect, there's nothing left to defend, just life, raw and immediate. It may feel unsettling at first, but it's not death. It's the end of the false center, and from here, the world becomes intimate. The wind is not felt by me, it is simply felt. Meaning doesn't vanish with the self, it becomes clearer. Love, joy, compassion often arise more freely when the self steps aside. There is no need to destroy the self, just let it dissolve, quietly, gently, not in despair, but in recognition. And then, what remains? This moment, this breath, not I am alive, just there is life.